In this tutorial, we'll be building a simple React application that allows you to search GitHub repositories that match a certain query. I have the application built here already, so we'll take a look at what we'll build and then we'll get started. So here I have a search input where a user can type in the query. I'll type in HTML, press enter, and we'll take that query, call GitHub API, and retrieve the results, and we'll loop over them and then display a list of all the repositories we found. These are hyperlinks, so users can then take, if they want to, browse around, click on this, and explore the repos. So that's the rough idea. So let's get started. For this tutorial, I assume you have some rough knowledge of JavaScript, Node, you're roughly familiar with Create React App, and for my editor, I will be using Visual Studio Code. You can use Sublime, Atom, whatever you're comfortable with. So I have the links here. You can, if you don't have Node installed, you can just go to nodejs.org, click on these download links, and then install it. Yarn is optional. You could also just use npm. That comes bundled with Node.js. And then Create React App, I'll use that to scaffold React application quickly without having to set up Webpack and configure that myself. All right, so let's get started. All right, so I have my terminal open here. I'll go ahead and run npx create react app, and then the name of the repo we want to create. So in this case, I'll call it react GitHub search. I'm using npx here also. This comes bundled with Node itself. Essentially what that does is if you don't have Create React App installed, it will go ahead and download that. And then once downloaded, it'll run that command and then create a repo. So I'll go ahead and press enter. We'll give it a few seconds here to finish. This will download all the dependencies we need for our project. So React, React DOM, as well as its dependencies. By that I mean Create React Apps dependencies that it needs in order to package and run the application, such as Webpack, Babel, etc. All right, so I'll let this finish. All right, so once this completes, you'll see that it prints out the next set of commands we can run. Start, build, test, eject. So we'll just go ahead and start the development server. So we'll cd into the repo. I'll open up my editor from here, and then while that happens, I will also go ahead and run yarn start. This will start a server in development mode, so we can iterate pretty quickly. So here we go. So if you have everything installed and configured correctly, you should see this screen. All right, so let's take a look here what we have. So we have a package.json with all the dependencies here. So you can see it has React and React DOM as our dependencies and React scripts. This is what starts the development server. You can see the struct command here. So whenever we run npm start or yarn run start or just yarn start, this is the command that runs behind the scenes. All right, the rest of it is not so important for today. All right, and then we have a public directory. Inside of that, you'll find some logos, index.html, and the favicon file. So index.html is pretty static here, not too much going on here. What I will do is I'll update the title so it reflects correctly in our browser tab here, GitHub search. And what you'll note here is that we only have one div with an ID of root. We don't have a script tag. So what happens behind the scenes is when you run yarn start or npm start, this React scripts that comes bundled with Create React App will take all of our JavaScript file, which is inside a source directory and starts with index.js. It'll take all the dependencies of this file, package it up in one single file instead of multiple files that you might have, and then creates a URI for that JavaScript, and then adds a script tag right after the div. So if I go back here, right click and view page source, you can see here that in addition to div root, it added the script tags. So it added a source for bundle, it added another one for chunk, it'll add another one for main. And if you go back to later, you can see that we don't actually have a script tag. So all of that is done by create React app or Webpack behind the scenes. But that's sort of just a rough overview of how everything runs. Perhaps I can do a different video on the nitty-gritty of like what actually happens behind the scenes in much more detail. All right, so let's get started. So as I said, index.js is the file that kicks off everything. We have a few imports at the top, React and React DOM. Then we are importing index.css. If you open that, you can see we have simple styles for body, and just removing the margin font family, and code element. We're not going to be using code element, so I'm going to remove that. Then we are importing app.js. This is where everything's happening right now. We are importing logo at the top, CSS, and some markup here. So I'm going to remove the logo, clean up this markup, and remove the class name as well. And if you go to app CSS, I'm going to delete all these styles as we're going to be writing our own. Cool. So if we take a look at our browser, you can see we have a completely empty page. So going back to index.js, then we have the service worker. We're not going to be using service worker for now, so I'm going to remove that as well, and then remove this and register method at the bottom. Cool. Okay. So everything is good to go. So let's go and do one last bit of thing. Let's also delete this logo SVG. So I'm going to command click service worker and then right click and delete both of those files. All right, so we have a clean state now. So let's get started. So here we only have an empty div inside of a JavaScript file. If you're new to React, this might be a bit confusing. How are we rendering HTML in JavaScript file? Well, so this is where JSX comes into play. What's happening behind the scenes is Webpack is using Babel, which is a transpiler that basically takes this code that looks like HTML and then converts behind the scenes into function calls. So what this gets converted into is a function call behind the scenes where it calls React's create element method and creates an element of type div, which is what we said here. So if you had a paragraph here, that would be a p tag over there. And this is the reason why we always need to import React whenever we are creating React components, even though we are technically not using anything from React here, right? Like we're not using react.component or useState just yet, but we still need to import it for that to work. Cool. Okay, so let's go ahead and create an input element for a user to type in. So I'll go ahead and create an input element of type text. We'll give it a name attribute of query, and we'll also give it a placeholder of search GitHub repositories. Okay, so if you go back to our browser, we can see that we have our input there on the screen. Okay, now that we have our input in place, we want to let users type in the input and read a value, make an API call when they press enter. There are a couple of ways to go about this. One is we can listen for onChange event, which is triggered anytime a user types a character. save that somewhere, and I'm going to user presses enter. Using the value, we make an API call. What this means though is we would be saving the value every time a user types a character. Alternative is we can let user type, and when they press enter, then read the value and make an API call. So I'm going to implement the latter approach. We can also implement the first one. So in order to do that, I'm going to leverage native behaviors and features where possible. So the way we can achieve that easily is we can just wrap that input in a form element. What this means is we get the enter handler sort of for free. And what I mean is whenever whenever there are inputs inside of a form and a user presses enter, browsers treat those as a submit action on the form, and it triggers an onSubmit handler when that happens. So let's see what that looks like. So I'm going to go ahead and add an onSubmit handler, which is going to take a function as a parameter, and the function gets passed in one parameter called event. So we'll just add a log here. Okay, so let's see. So I'm going to type in HTML, press enter. We can see there's a log here briefly, but then a browser reloaded, which is the default behavior of a browser whenever there's a submit, because it tries to make a call to the backend. So we don't want that default behavior. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to use the event object, and using it, I'm going to call the prevent default method on it, which is going to prevent the default behavior for us, which is to reload the browser. So now if you go back, remove the query because that was added by the page refresh. Now if I type in HTML, press enter, we can see that browser doesn't reload anymore, and then our log gets logged. Awesome, that's what we wanted. Cool. So now let's figure out how to get the value of this input. Again, there are a couple of ways here, but I'm going to use the JavaScript API to sort of read it. And what I mean here is, instead of debugger here, so I can actually show that to you. Okay, so I added a debugger here. What that means is whenever there's a submit, browser will pause the execution and will let us inspect what's in the event object or in its outer scope. Cool. So I'll press HTML again, press enter, and here I'll collapse this. So I'll hide the navigator, and we can see we have the event object. Cool. So I'll type in event dot target. Event dot target is the element on which basically the event got triggered. In this case, it's a form. Cool. So then target, or the form, has a property elements, which is a special property in the forms which has the information about what were the elements inside of the form. So as we can see here, there's one property called query, and this matches the name we gave to our input. So if you had multiple inputs, they'll all be here in this object. So if I were to say elements dot query, then that would give us a reference to the input element itself, as you can see here. And if I say dot then value, this would give us the value of that query input element. So if I press enter, you'll see that we can read the value using the native APIs. Okay, so I'm going to copy this, go back, and then say instead of this, I'm going to replace it with the value. Okay, so let play, and let's try again just to make sure everything works. HTML, cool, gets logged. JS, press enter, cool, gets logged. Awesome. All right, so now that's working. Before I go any further, I also want to say, again, there's another way of doing this, which is using refs, but I'll skip that for now and maybe do a separate video on that if necessary. But we can also sort of store input in a reference using useRef hook, and then read the value from there as well. But I think this is simple enough, so this will suffice. Okay, so now we need to act upon this value and make an API call. So before we do any of that further, let's go to GitHub API. Let's take a look at the v3 API. And let's see, where do we have the search API? So I'm just trying to find it here. So Command F, type in search, press enter, go up a little. Oh, there we go. So there's a search on the right. And okay, I want to search repositories. Cool. All right, let's see. Find repositories by certain criteria. This method returns up to 100 results per page. Okay. When searching for repositories, you can get text match metadata for name and description fields when you pass text match media type. Okay, cool. There's a bunch of parameters we can pass here: query, queue, and then sort. Okay, that's nice. So let's try this query actually. I'm gonna copy this URL, just that, and press enter. All right, seems to be working. So here I'm searching for repositories that have Tetris. Or you could just type in HTML, press enter. Awesome, so this just gives us repositories that match HTML. Cool, so that's the API endpoint we would be calling. All right, so I'm gonna copy that, come back here, paste it, so we can tweak that later. Okay, based on whatever the user has typed. All right, so now let's see, how can we make an API call when the value changes? Okay, so we need a way to sort of figure out whenever this changes, we make a call. So in order to achieve that, I'm going to be using two hooks, useState and useEffect. Okay, so let's see how that works. So in order to store this information and react to its changes, we need to store this information somewhere whenever this changes. So in order to do that, I'm going to use the useState hook. So we'll say state and initialize that to react.useState. You can pass in, useState takes in two types of parameters, either a value or a function that returns the value. If it's a function, it will only get called once. Okay, so I will initialize that with an empty string for now because we don't have any value to start off with. And I'm going to go ahead and log what the state looks like. Go back here, and you can see that the useState essentially returns an array with two elements. This is the value. The first element is the value, and the second is the function that lets us update the value. Okay, so I can either say something like state 0, which gives us the value, or 1 to retrieve the function to update the value, as you can see here. Okay, this is the function implementation, not so important to look at. So instead of doing that, I'm going to use destructuring to destructure the first and second items of the array. So I'll store the first one into a variable named input value, and second one into a variable called set input value. Okay, so now that we have that, what we can do is, instead of just logging it, we can actually set it, set input value, and copy that there, and paste it in, and I'll remove the log now. So now I can log that value instead, const input value. So we go back to the browser, press HTML, press enter. We can see that new value gets logged from line 8, right? So what happens is user presses enter, we call the set input value hook, which updates the state variable, or the state, which notifies React that state has changed of this app component. So it re-renders it. But that time, the value of input value is the one that we updated with. So instead of empty string, it's whatever the user typed. In this case, it's HTML. Okay. So now that we have that stored, we want to react to its change. In order to do that, we'll use effect hook. Now, use effect is basically for anytime you want to do a side effect, hence the name use effect, outside of React rendering. Meaning, if you want to fetch data from an API, if you want to use some sort of timer or a timeout or intersection observer to monitor DOM changes and whatnot. But basically, anytime you want to use JavaScript native API to do something that is not related to rendering, we can leverage use effect. Okay, and use effect will here, by the way it is, it will render the function inside of the use effect will run anytime the app re-renders for any reason. But in this case, we don't want that. We only want the effect to run when the input value changes to let React sort of know that we want that. There's a second parameter here, which is the dependencies that the use effect depends on, which is an array. And here you can pass in as many values as you want, and whenever the value of that changes, the effect gets rerun. So here we only have one dependency, input value. Now, so move the log inside of that. And let's see. So now if we go back, you can see we already have a log entry here, but it's empty. So what happens is the app component renders the first time. So you're just starting off, the effect hasn't run, so it runs at one time. So the effect ran, the value happens to be empty, so we saw the log. Okay, so in this case, we don't want that. Like, we want the effect to get run, but we don't actually want to make an API call. So we can easily do that with just an if statement. So if there's no input value, then simply just return. We don't want to make any API call. And here we'll make API calls, right? Because now we know that we actually have a value that we can use. So let's try that out. Okay, so this time we can see that when the app rendered, we don't see a log entry because we just returned it, right? And I can add a log here to sort of demonstrate that. Input, no input value, returning. And there you go. You can see no input value returning early. Okay. So now let's test it out, make sure it still works. So I press type HTML, press enter. Cool, it's logged. All right, so now we are in a pretty good state. We can actually make API calls. All right, so to make API calls, we can either use XML HTTP request. That's been around for a while. That's a built-in browser API that allows us to make API calls. XML HTTP request. Another is fetch API. This is the modern API to make API calls. and the other is a popular library, Axios, to make API calls. Axios is a pretty popular library to make API calls, but I'm going to use just the native fetch for now. We don't have anything complicated going on here. So, okay. So the way the fetch API works is if we take a look, let's see if you have an example here. Let's see, basics concepts. I don't see an example, so let me just search for that. Okay, so here we go. It provides a JavaScript interface for accessing and manipulating parts of the HTTP pipeline, so requests and responses. Okay, let's see. All right, so here we have an example. So let's just go ahead and copy this and paste it here. Okay, so here it looks like it's the first parameter is whatever endpoint you want to call. So in this case, we know we want to call endpoint that looks like this. But we want this to change based on whatever the value we have it, what the value we have in our state. Okay, well, so I can just get rid of the hard-coded part and concatenate our value. And then we get a response back. But the response here is a raw response. Even though it comes back as JSON, it's not actually converted to JSON. So in order to do that, we need to use the .json method, which takes the raw response and converts that into JSON. And we get back an object. It's just called my JSON here. I'll call it data. And we should have the response essentially. So let's go back to the browser and take a look. Type in HTML, press enter. Sweet. So we have our response coming back. So we can see that there were a total of 525,000 repos that matched our query. But we got back 30. That's good. And you can also alternatively take a look at network tab and go to all or XHR if you just want to take a look at XML HTTP request or fetch methods. You can click on it and you can look at all the response headers that came back and the object. One thing I'll point out is if you look at headers, you'll also see information about rate limiting. Since we are using public GitHub API without any sort of authentication, we have limits of, I believe this is 10 per minute, but I could be wrong. So since we made one request already, this is telling us we have 9 requests left. So that's good to know. Okay, so I'll go back to console and we can see we have a response coming back. Sweet. And if we look at the items and expand the object, we have the ID of the repo, node ID, we have the name, okay, that's what I want, and description. Okay, I think that's enough. That's all we need for today. So we'll start using that. Okay, so now that we have our data, we are just logging it, but we need to, again, using the data, render a list. So we'll use state again. So I'll create another state variable. This time I will store that in repos and call the function that lets us update it, call it set repos, react.useState. And the default value for repos is just going to be empty array, because we don't have any repos when we render the component initially. So now that we are state, here we can call set repos, and the value of this will be what was it? I think it was data.items, I believe. So we want to take the items property, the read items property, off of the response and store that in our state. Okay, So let's go ahead and log repos as well, so we can see if it's working correctly. So you can see it's empty initially. There we go. So we can see we have our response come back. This is our log inside of the callback of the fetch. And this is, I believe, the log we just added from line 25. Yeah. Okay. So we have our repos being stored in our state. So now what we can do is we can come down here, and right after the form element, we can render a list element. So what we can do is we can map over our repos. This will be a single repo. And for every repo, oh, let me wrap this in URL actually. For every repo, we want to return or render an li with a name and a description. Okay, so in order to do that, I will wrap this in curly braces, repo.name. Let's give that a try. Oh, awesome. So we can see we have our simple list here working. But with warning here that a child in a list should have a unique key prop. This is a bit more complicated topic to talk about, so for now I'll skip it. But essentially, for every item in a list, we need to tell React what its unique ID is. So we already have an ID property of the node of the repo. We also have a node ID. So looks like we can use both of them because it's unique per repo. So I'll say key with a value of, I'll just use ID, but really doesn't matter if you used node ID. So now if you try that again, this time we don't have the warning anymore since we passed key to React. Okay, so let's go ahead and add some more stuff here. So we wanted to add description as well and make this a link. So I'll wrap this in anchor tag. Let's see, what do we have the full URL? Yes, we have the HTML URL. Okay, so I can say href is equal to repo dot HTML URL, and then here we'll add a paragraph tag, and the value of that will be repo.description. Okay, let's try that. All right, I guess I meant to type HTML, but HTML will do, so it looks like it's working. If I hover over this, you can see in the bottom left, the URLs are looking good. Cool, and we also have the description. Awesome. Okay, so we have most of it working. Cool. All right, so what are we gonna do? Let's go ahead and style this a little bit then. We will give this some classes so we can target this in the CSS. So I'll give input a class of Github search input. Now, in JavaScript, class is a reserved word. So instead of using class as we might in just HTML, in React, we need to use class name instead to avoid the collision with native class keyword. So I'll call it class name with a GitHub search input. So if I hit save, go to element, click on the picker, and find this guy, you can see that we have a class set to GitHub search input. So what we can do now is we can go to app.css and we can provide some styling. So we can say we want that element to be, well, it's a block element right now, so let's make it a full width. Display block, cool, it's full. Font size, maybe bigger, 20px. We'll give it some padding. Top 1 rem, 5 rem. Okay, that's good. Let's go ahead and remove the border and just add a border bottom of 1 pixel, solid 111 character. Sweet. Okay. Actually, let's make it a lighter shade actually by default. But make it dark on focus. Sweet. So now it's just light gray. If I click on it, looks good. Now it looks black. But we also have the outline. So let's remove that. We don't want, since we are handling the focus styles ourselves, we don't want any default outline. There we go. So gray, click on it, nice black underline. Okay, going back, let's style our UL. So we'll give this a class name of repo list, and we'll give our allies a class of repo item. So we can say repo list. There's some default styling here, the dots. Let's go ahead and clean those up. I believe it's list style and none. Cool. And there's also, if you take a look at the UL element, there's some margin, default margin and padding that all the browsers apply. Let's go ahead and clean that up as well. We don't want any default stylings. We want to control it ourselves. Okay. And now, well, maybe we could just zeroing out, we can say it's 1 rem all around. Okay, perfect. Sweet. Okay, so I think this is pretty good. Let's click on the link. Looks like it's opening in the same tab. We don't want user to navigate away from our site, so we can fix that by adding a target with a value of blank. And what that means is whenever the user clicks on the link, it's open in a blank tab, leaving our app in its current state. So if I click, there you go, it opens in a separate tab. Okay, this seems to be working. Let's search for something else. JavaScript. And it updates. So I guess we can add one improvement here. We should show an indicator to the user that we're actually searching for, or we're making an API call and waiting for the results. So to do that, we can add another state variable to help us track of what state we are in. So I'll add another variable called is loading, and call its function set is loading. And the default value for loading is false because we're not searching anything right away. So let's see where we should update this to be true when we start making the call. And that is right here. So add set is loading to true. And then when we get the data back, we should also set it to false as we're not loading the data anymore. Okay. So let's see, let's try and use it. So here we want to say if the variable is true, then display a message loading, otherwise don't. To do that, we can use a simple ternary operator or and. So I'll use curly braces and then say if is loading is true, then I want to add a message loading. Otherwise, just null. Or simply, since we don't have any fallback that we're rendering, if it's not, then we could just use the short circuit operator, double and skip this altogether. So what it's saying is, if this is true, then do this. Otherwise, it won't do anything. So if we try that now, you can see we get a loading message and then the results. If we change the query, press enter, we see the loading message and then we see the results. Okay, I think this is pretty good. Couple of improvements we can make here. We're not handling any errors that might arise. Maybe if you're making a bad API call, or we have exceeded our API limits. So it'd be nice to sort of handle that. The way you can do that is you can add a catch handler, which gets passed in the error. So for now, what we can do is we can just add a log that logs the error message. But if you wanted to, we can also do the same thing we did for loading, which is we can add another state for the error. And if you have an error message, we can display the error message along with our other information. And when the error arises, we also probably want to set is loading to false. Okay, so let's just go to do that actually for good measure. So I'll call error, set error, so we don't have an error when we start out with. And when this occurs, we also want to say set error equals true. So now what we can do is similar to is loading. I'll just copy that. We can say if there's an error, display a message unexpected error occurred fetching data. All right, seems to be working. Okay, I think this is in a good state. We can remove the logs, or this log at least. We can leave this be. There's also alternatively error method, which will print the error message in red color, so it's easy to identify, easy to spot. But okay. All right. So to summarize, what we did is we added a form with an input. We are listening for the submit event. We prevent the default because we don't want the browser to reload. And then we set the input value in a state. We have a couple of states at the top that keeps track of what the input value is, what the loading is, or sorry, whether we are loading or not, is if there's an error, and what our repos are, if any, we've fetched. And then we used use effect in order to react to changes in state of input value. So whenever there's an input change, the effect gets rerun. We update our is loading to true as we are making an API call. We actually then make the API call to GitHub. We take the response, convert that into JSON. Then we have two possibilities. Either we get the data or we error out. So when we get the data, we just log it. And then we update our is loading to false. And then we update our repos with the items property from the response. And if there's an error, we set is loading to false. And then we update our error state to true. so we can use that later on in our rendering and update the message. So as you can see, if there's a loading, we're just loading message, and if there's an error, we're displaying just a div saying, hey, unexpected error occurred. And then if neither of those were true, and if you had repos, then we just go ahead and render a list of repos. Cool. If you liked this video, please hit the like and subscribe button. Helps out a lot. See you in the next one.